The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of West Texas, turning what should have been fertile farmland into a patchwork of dust and broken dreams. Thomas Tom Mitchell wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed the withered corn stalks that represented his third failed harvest in as many years. At 40 years old, Tom had the hands of a man who'd worked the soil his entire life. But the hope in his eyes had dimmed considerably since his wife Sarah had passed from consumption 2 winters ago. The small farmhouse they'd built together with their own hands now felt too large and too quiet, echoing with memories of laughter that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The drought had been relentless this year. What little rain had fallen came too late or too early, never when the crops needed it most. Tom's neighbors, those who hadn't already packed up and headed back east, spoke in hushed tones about abandoning their claims and starting over somewhere with more forgiving soil and reliable weather. But Tom couldn't bring himself to leave. This patch of stubborn Texas earth held everything he and Sarah had dreamed of building together. Every fence post driven into the hard ground, every stone cleared from the fields, every improvement made to the humble farmhouse represented a piece of their shared vision. To abandon it now would feel like abandoning her memory. He walked slowly through what remained of his cornfield, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was a full day's ride to the east, and his closest neighbor lived 5 miles away across the rolling hills. The isolation that had once felt like peaceful solitude now pressed down on him like a physical weight. In his crude root cellar, Tom knew exactly what remained of his stores: 3 loaves of bread that would last him perhaps a week if he was careful, a small sack of beans, some preserved meat that was already showing signs of age, and enough flour for maybe 2 more bakings. It wasn't much, but it was all that stood between him and the charity of strangers, something his proud nature rebelled against accepting. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Tom made his way back to the farmhouse, a simple 2-room structure with a covered porch that Sarah had always loved. The rocking chair where she used to sit and watch the sunset still sat in its familiar spot, though Tom couldn't bring himself to sit in it. Instead, he lowered himself onto the porch steps and looked out over his struggling land. The silence was profound. No cattle lowing, no chickens clucking, no sound of children playing. He'd had to sell his livestock months ago to pay what debts he could, and the chickens had succumbed to a fox that had grown bold in its hunger. Even the usual chorus of insects seemed muted in the oppressive heat. Tom pulled out his pocket watch, a wedding gift from Sarah, and noted that it was nearly sunset. Time to head inside, eat a simple supper of bread and beans, and try to sleep despite the worry that gnawed at him constantly. Tomorrow he would walk the fields again, check the meager vegetable garden behind the house, and hope against hope that some miracle might still save this year's harvest. As he stood to go inside, a movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. Something was moving across the far hill, silhouetted against the orange sky. Tom squinted, trying to make out what it might be. Not cattle, he knew their shape too well. Not a neighbor's wagon either. The figure grew closer, resolving into the unmistakable form of a person on foot, moving slowly and with evident exhaustion. In this isolated country, an unexpected visitor could mean many things. A lost traveler, a bearer of news, or potentially trouble. Tom waited on his porch, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. But as the figure drew nearer, illuminated by the dying light of day, his caution transformed into something else entirely. It was a woman, and she was carrying someone in her arms. As the woman approached, Tom could see that she was clearly Apache, her long black hair braided with traditional beads and her clothing bearing the distinctive patterns he recognized from the few peaceful encounters he'd had with tribal members over the years. But what struck him most forcefully was not her heritage, it was her condition. She moved with the unsteady gait of someone pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Her clothes were dusty and torn in places, suggesting a long and difficult journey. In her arms, she carried a small child, a toddler perhaps 2 years old, who appeared to be sleeping but whose stillness worried Tom more than he cared to admit. The woman stopped about 20 yards from his porch, swaying slightly on her feet. Even from that distance, Tom could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her body. The way she held the child protectively against her chest, the careful alertness in her posture despite her obvious fatigue. For several long moments, They simply looked at each other across the dusty yard. Tom knew that tensions between settlers and the Apache had been high throughout the region, with stories of raids and conflicts reaching even his isolated farm. But looking at this young woman, she couldn't be more than 28, holding her child with such tender desperation, he saw not a threat but a fellow human being in dire need. Slowly, carefully, Tom set his rifle aside and stepped down from the porch. The woman tensed, ready to flee, but something in his deliberate, non-threatening movements seemed to reassure her. He stopped halfway across the yard and spread his hands to show he carried no weapons. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "You look like you could use some help." The woman's eyes, large and dark in her dust-streaked face, studied him intently. When she spoke, it was in accented but clear English that surprised him with its precision. "Water," she said simply, the single word carrying the weight of desperate need. "Please, for the child." Tom nodded immediately and gestured toward the porch. "Of course. Please come sit." He hurried inside and returned with his water bucket and a clean cup, setting them on the porch steps before backing away to give her space. The woman approached cautiously, her maternal instincts clearly warring with her survival training. As she knelt beside the water bucket, Tom got his first clear look at the child in her arms. The little one was indeed asleep, but it was the deep, troubling sleep of illness or severe dehydration. The child's lips were dry and cracked, and even in the dim light, Tom could see that the small face was flushed with fever. The woman cupped water in her hands and let a few drops fall between the child's lips, speaking soft words in Apache that Tom didn't understand but whose meaning was universal. The urgent, loving murmurs of a mother caring for her sick baby. After the child had taken a little water, the woman drank deeply herself, her restraint clearly costing her tremendous effort. Tom could see that she was probably as dehydrated as her child, but her priority remained absolutely focused on the little one's needs. "When did you last eat?" Tom asked gently. The woman looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw pride warring with necessity. Finally, she held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the setting sun. 3 days. Without hesitation, Tom went back into the house and returned with one of his 3 remaining loaves of bread. It was fresh. He'd baked it that morning, and it represented a full day's worth of food for him. But looking at this mother and child, he knew there was only one choice to make. He broke the loaf carefully in half and offered one portion to the woman. She stared at it for a long moment, then at him, as if trying to understand why a stranger would show such kindness to someone from a people often viewed as enemies. "Please," Tom said simply. "Take it." The woman accepted the bread with a dignity that struck Tom as profoundly moving. She tore off small pieces and softened them with water before feeding them to her child, who roused enough to eat a little before falling back into that concerning sleep. As the last light faded from the western sky, Tom made a decision that would change his life forever. "You can sleep in the barn tonight," he said. "It's dry and warm and there's fresh hay. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you both properly fed and rested." The woman looked at him for a long moment, then spoke a few words in Apache before translating. "I said, 'This man has honor. My name is Ayanna. This is my son, Kachina.'" "Tom Mitchell," he replied with a slight nod. "And you're both welcome here as long as you need." Neither of them knew that their conversation had been observed from the hills surrounding the farm, or that runners were already carrying word of this encounter to places where such news would be discussed by men who held the power to determine the fate of entire communities. Tom led Ayanna and little Kachina to his barn, a sturdy structure that had weathered 3 Texas winters and remained one of the more successful projects he and Sarah had completed together. He quickly spread fresh hay in the cleanest corner and brought out a worn but serviceable blanket from the house. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it'll keep the night chill off." Ayanna settled her son in the makeshift bed, her movements gentle but efficient. Kachina stirred briefly, opening eyes that were too bright with fever before settling back into sleep. In the lamplight, Tom could see the child more clearly, a beautiful little boy with his mother's intelligent eyes and delicate features. "How long has he been sick?" Tom asked, his voice low with concern. 4 days, Ayanna replied, not taking her eyes off her son, "since we left our camp." "You've been walking for 4 days?" She nodded. "Our band was attacked by Mexican slave traders from the south. Many were killed or taken, Kachina and I escaped, but we had no food, no horses. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Slave traders were a scourge that plagued the borderlands, preying on anyone vulnerable enough to be captured and sold. The thought of this young mother fleeing with her sick child through hostile territory for 4 days filled him with both admiration for her courage and anger at the circumstances that had forced such a choice. Where were you heading? North to my brother's band near the Red River, but Kachina grew too weak to travel. Her voice caught slightly. I thought we might die out there. Tom knelt down and gently felt the child's forehead. The fever was high but not dangerously so, and the little boy's breathing seemed steady. I'm no doctor, he said, but I've seen my share of fevers. With rest and proper food, he should recover. Ayana's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging as some of the terrible tension she'd been carrying finally eased. You are very kind to strangers. My wife used to say that kindness was the only currency that mattered in a hard land, Tom replied, surprised to find himself speaking of Sarah without the usual stab of pain. She would have done the same thing. Your wife? Past 2 years ago. Consumption. Ayana studied his face in the lamplight. You understand loss? I do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Kachina's steady breathing and the familiar sounds of the barn settling around them. Finally, Tom rose to leave them to their rest. Mr. Mitchell, Ayana called softly as he reached the door. Why do you help us? Your people and mine. We are not often friends. Tom paused, considering the question seriously. Because you knocked on my door hungry and I had bread? Seems simple enough to me. As he walked back to the farmhouse, Tom noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. There, at the edge of his vision, was the faint glow of a small fire on the distant hills, then another farther to the north, and another to the west. Signal fires. Tom's experience with frontier life told him exactly what he was seeing. Word was being passed through the Apache network that operated invisible, but efficiently throughout the territory. News of Ayana and Kachina's location, and of his decision to help them, was traveling faster than any horse could carry it. He stood in his doorway for several minutes, watching the distant fires appear and disappear as messages were relayed across the vast landscape. By morning, he realized every Apache band within 100 miles would know that a white farmer had shown kindness to one of their own. Inside the farmhouse, Tom lay awake long into the night, not from worry but from something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had been able to help someone, to make a difference in another person's life. The feeling was both humbling and invigorating. What he didn't know was that his small act of kindness had set in motion events that would reshape the relationship between the Apache Nation and the scattered settlements of West Texas. In council fires, throughout the region, war chiefs and elders were discussing the white farmer who had shared his last bread with a desperate mother, and they were making decisions that would surprise everyone. Most of all Tom Mitchell himself. As the first gray light of dawn crept across the Texas plains, Tom finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that his farm was about to become the center of something much larger than one man's simple choice to show compassion to strangers in need. Tom woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and immediately thought of his guests in the barn. He dressed quickly and stepped outside into the cool pre-dawn air, planning to check on Kachina's condition and perhaps start a fire to warm some milk for the boy. But as he rounded the corner of his farmhouse, he froze mid-step. The hills surrounding his property, which had been empty and peaceful when he'd gone to sleep, were now lined with motionless figures, Apache warriors on horseback, sitting as still as statues in the growing light. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to count them. 50. 100 more appearing even as he watched. They made no threatening moves, carried no raised weapons, but their sheer number was overwhelming. These weren't raiders or a small hunting party. This was a significant force, organized and purposeful. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against his porch, but he stopped himself. Whatever was happening here, a single weapon wouldn't make any difference. Besides, if they had meant him harm, he would already be dead. Instead, he walked steadily toward the barn, forcing himself to maintain a calm demeanor despite the electric tension that seemed to fill the air. Behind him, he heard the distant sound of approaching horses from the east, riders coming fast from the direction of Cedar Falls. Inside the barn, Ayana was awake, sitting beside her son and singing softly in Apache. Kachina looked better. His fever had broken during the night and his breathing was clear and strong. The child was even sitting up, playing with a small carved toy that his mother had produced from somewhere in her few possessions. "Good morning," Tom said, trying to keep his voice normal. "How is he feeling?" "Much better," Ayana replied, but her eyes were watchful. She had heard the approaching riders too. "The rest and food helped greatly." "Ayana," Tom said carefully, "I need to tell you something. There are quite a few of your people on the hills around my farm." She nodded calmly. "I know they have been arriving all night." "You knew?" "The signal fires last night. Word traveled fast about the white farmer who shared his bread." She stood, settling Kachina more comfortably in the hay. "They came to see if the stories were true." The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, and Tom recognized the sound of multiple horses being ridden hard. Through the barn door he could see dust clouds rising from the east. A party of riders from town, probably led by Sheriff Crawford. "This could get complicated," Tom muttered. Ayana's expression grew serious. "Your people are coming?" "Looks like it." "The sheriff, probably some of the town council. They would have seen the signal fires too, would have known something was happening out here." Before Ayana could respond, the sound of horses entering Tom's yard announced the arrival of the Cedar Falls contingent. Through the barn door, Tom could see Sheriff Crawford and 5 other men, all armed, all looking grimly determined. "Mitchell!" Crawford's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out here! We need to talk." Tom looked at Ayana, who had instinctively moved to shield her son. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." He walked out of the barn to face the mounted men. Sheriff Crawford was a decent man under normal circumstances, but Tom could see the tension and fear in his face. The other men, Tom recognized the banker, the general store owner, and 3 ranchers from the surrounding area, looked like they were expecting trouble. "Morning, Sheriff," Tom said calmly. "What brings you out so early?" Crawford gestured toward the hills where the Apache warriors remained motionless and watching. "We saw the signal fires last night. Then riders reported seeing war parties moving through the territory. Word in town is that there might be trouble brewing." "No trouble here," Tom replied. "Just a sick child getting better." "Don't play games with us, Mitchell," snapped Henderson, the banker. "We know you've got Apache on your property. The whole countryside's buzzing with it." Tom felt his jaw tighten. "I've got a woman and her young son who needed help. Nothing more, nothing less." Sheriff Crawford leaned forward in his saddle. "Tom, I've known you for 5 years and you're a good man. But look around." He gestured toward the surrounding hills. "There's got to be 300 warriors out there. Maybe more. They didn't come here for a social call. Have any of them threatened anyone? Made any hostile moves?" "Well, no," Crawford admitted. "But that many Apache in one place means something big is happening." As if summoned by their conversation, a single rider detached himself from the group on the nearest hill and began riding slowly toward the farmyard. Tom watched as the warrior approached, an older man with gray streaking his long hair, his bearing dignified and commanding. The rider stopped just outside the yard and spoke in clear, accented English. "I am Running Wolf, war chief of the Mescalero Apache. I come to speak with the farmer Mitchell." The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches. Sheriff Crawford's hand moved to his pistol, and Tom could hear the other men shifting nervously in their saddles. But Tom stepped forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm Tom Mitchell. You're welcome on my land, Chief Running Wolf." What happened next would be talked about in both Apache camps and Texas saloons for generations to come. Running Wolf dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. He was tall and lean, his weathered face bearing the kind of dignity that comes from years of leadership and difficult decisions. A single eagle feather adorned his hair, and his clothing, while practical for riding, bore the intricate beadwork that marked him as a man of high status within his tribe. The Apache war chief walked slowly toward Tom, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The nervous white men on horseback, the isolated farmhouse, the signs of struggle against drought and hardship evident everywhere in the failing crops and bare earth. "Tom Mitchell," Running Wolf said, his voice carrying easily across the tense silence. "You have shown kindness to Ayana, daughter of my brother, and to her son Kachina. This kindness has traveled on the wind, and many have come to see the truth of it. Sheriff Crawford leaned forward in his saddle. Chief, we don't want any trouble here. If you've come for the woman and child, you can take them and go in peace. Running Wolf's gaze shifted to the sheriff, and Tom saw a flash of something. Not anger. Exactly, but a kind of controlled displeasure. Sheriff Crawford, the chief said, surprising everyone by knowing the lawman's name. No one takes Ayanna anywhere. She is free to choose her path, as are all Apache women. Then what do you want? Demanded Henderson, the banker. Before Running Wolf could answer, the barn door opened and Ayanna emerged, carrying Kachina in her arms. The little boy looked much better, alert and curious about all the strangers in his temporary home. Ayanna walked steadily across the yard and stopped beside Tom, her presence clearly indicating her choice to align herself with the farmer who had helped them. Uncle, she said to Running Wolf in English, ensuring that everyone could understand. This man shared his last bread with us when we were dying. He asked for nothing in return, expected nothing in return. He acted with honor. Running Wolf nodded solemnly, then turned back to Tom. In our tradition, such an act creates bonds between peoples. You have fed our family when they were hungry. This makes you family to us. Tom felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, not just the Apache warriors on the hills, but the nervous townsfolk behind him. His next words would matter enormously, not just for his own future, but potentially for the relationship between two very different communities. I don't know much about traditions, Chief, Tom said honestly, but I know about doing what's right. Ayanna and Kachina needed help, and I had help to give. That's all there was to it. A murmur went through the Apache ranks on the surrounding hills, barely audible, but Tom could sense approval in the sound. Running Wolf studied him for a long moment, then spoke words that would change everything. The Apache Nation recognizes Tom Mitchell as a brother. His land is sacred to us, his family is our family, his enemies are our enemies. The chief paused, letting the full weight of his declaration settle, and those who threaten him threaten us all. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. In a single statement, Running Wolf had placed Tom under the protection of one of the most powerful Apache confederations in the Southwest. It was an honor unprecedented in the history of white Apache relations in Texas, but it was also something that could be seen as a threat by the nervous settlers, who were still learning to live alongside their Apache neighbors. Henderson, the banker, couldn't contain himself any longer. Now see here, you can't just declare some kind of alliance with one of our citizens. There are laws, proper channels. Your laws, Running Wolf interrupted quietly, do not govern Apache hearts. Tom Mitchell has shown that honor exists between our peoples. We choose to recognize that honor. Sheriff Crawford, clearly out of his depth, but trying to maintain some semblance of authority, spoke up. Chief Running Wolf, I respect what you're trying to do here, but this puts us all in a difficult position. There are people in town, in the territorial government, who won't understand this kind of arrangement. Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but when he spoke, there was iron in his voice. Then perhaps it is time for them to learn. The war chief turned back to Tom. You have a choice to make, brother. Accept our protection and our friendship, knowing that it may bring you trouble with your own people. Or decline politely, and we will remember your kindness but leave you to your old life. Tom looked around the circle of faces, white and Apache alike, all waiting for his answer. He thought of Sarah, of what she would have said about such a moment. He thought of the loneliness of the past 2 years, the sense of purposelessness that had haunted him since her death, and he thought of little Kachina, now healthy and alert, playing with a carved horse in his mother's arms. Chief Running Wolf, Tom said, his voice clear and firm. I would be honored to call you brother. The roar of approval from 300 Apache warriors echoed across the Texas plains like thunder, while the men from Cedar Falls sat in stunned silence, realizing that their quiet farming community had just become the center of something much larger than they had ever imagined. The sound of 300 Apache voices raised in celebration was unlike anything Tom had ever heard. It wasn't a war cry or a battle shout, but something deeper, a sound of recognition, of acceptance, of doors opening between two worlds that had been closed for too long. As the voices faded, Running Wolf stepped forward and placed both hands on Tom's shoulders. From this day forward, he said solemnly, you walk between two peoples. This is both a great honor and a great responsibility. Sheriff Crawford and his men watched the ceremony with expressions ranging from bewilderment to barely concealed alarm. Tom could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out what this meant for their community, their safety, and their relationship with the territorial government. "Chief Running Wolf," Crawford said carefully, "I need to understand exactly what we're talking about here." "Are you saying that Mr. Mitchell is now under some kind of Apache protection?" "I am saying," Running Wolf replied, "that Tom Mitchell is now family. When the Apache speak of family, we mean something your people might not fully understand. We mean that his prosperity is our prosperity, his security is our security, his honor is our honor." Henderson, the banker, looked like he was about to have apoplexy. "But this is highly irregular. There are no legal frameworks for this kind of arrangement. What happens when the territorial governor hears about this? What about the military?" Running Wolf's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Your governor and your military are welcome to discuss the matter with us. We are always interested in talking with those who approach us with respect." Ayanna, who had been quietly observing the exchange while keeping Kachina entertained, stepped forward. "Sheriff Crawford," she said, her English precise and clear. "May I ask you something?" Crawford nodded, clearly surprised to be addressed directly by an Apache woman. "In your laws, when a man saves another person's life, is this considered a good thing or a bad thing?" "Well, it's a good thing, of course." "And when someone shows hospitality to strangers in need, is this honorable or dishonorable?" "Honorable, naturally. Then why does it trouble you that we choose to honor someone who has done these good and honorable things?" The question hung in the air, its simple logic difficult to argue with. Tom found himself impressed by Ayanna's diplomatic skills. She had a way of cutting through complexity to reach the heart of an issue. Crawford removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Ma'am, it's not the honoring that troubles me. It's the practical implications. We've got a territorial government that's still figuring out how to deal with Apache tribes. Something like this. It could complicate things. Or," Running Wolf said quietly, "it could simplify them." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the east. A new group of riders was approaching, but these weren't coming from Cedar Falls. The dust cloud suggested a much larger party, and as they drew closer, Tom could see that some of the riders were Apache while others appeared to be white men in formal dress. "Ah," Running Wolf said with satisfaction, "they arrived sooner than I expected." "Who arrives?" Tom asked. "Representatives from the territorial government and from the federal Indian Agency. Word travels fast when 300 Apache warriors gather in one place. I sent runners last night to invite them to witness what happened here." Sheriff Crawford's eyes widened. "You planned this?" "I plan to be ready for whatever response your people might have to our gesture of friendship," Running Wolf replied calmly. It seemed wise to have official witnesses present. As the new group of riders approached, Tom could make out more details. There were indeed federal officials. He could tell by their formal dress and the military escort that accompanied them. But there were also Apache leaders he didn't recognize, men whose bearing and dress suggested they were chiefs or elders from other bands. "Chief Running Wolf," Tom said quietly, "what exactly am I getting myself into here?" The Apache leader smiled, the first truly warm expression Tom had seen from him. "Something that should have happened years ago, brother. You are about to become the first official liaison between the Apache Nation and the Texas territorial government." "The first what now?" Ayanna touched Tom's arm gently. "In Apache tradition, when someone is adopted into the tribe, they often become a bridge between our people and outsiders. You have shown that you can be trusted by both sides." Tom looked around at the sea of faces, Apache and white alike, all focused on him with varying degrees of expectation, hope, and uncertainty. Just yesterday morning he had been a struggling farmer worried about his next meal. Now he was apparently about to become some kind of diplomat. "I don't know anything about being a liaison," he said honestly. "You know about treating people fairly," Running Wolf replied. "You know about keeping your word. You know about putting others' needs before your own when it matters."
These are the only qualifications that truly matter. As the official party drew close enough for conversation,
Tom recognized one of the white men as Colonel James Morrison, the territorial Indian agent he'd met once, before in Cedar Falls. The military escort was led by a young lieutenant who looked distinctly nervous about the situation he was riding into. What happened in the next few minutes would determine not just Tom's future, but potentially the future of Apache-White relations throughout the entire Southwest Territory. And Tom Mitchell, poor farmer turned unlikely diplomat, was about to find out if his simple act of kindness could really build bridges between two worlds that had been at odds for generations. Colonel Morrison dismounted with the crisp efficiency of a career military man, but Tom noticed that he approached with his hands clearly visible and his weapons untouched, signs of respect that weren't lost on the Apache observers. The colonel was a lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that had seen enough frontier politics to understand the delicate nature of the situation he was entering. "Chief Running Wolf," Morrison said with a formal nod, "I received your message about developments here. I came as quickly as possible." "Colonel Morrison," Running Wolf replied with equal formality, "you are welcome. We have much to discuss." The federal Indian agent's gaze moved to Tom, studying him with obvious curiosity. "And you must be Mr. Mitchell. I've heard some rather extraordinary stories about you in the past 24 hours. Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just helped a woman and her sick child, Colonel. Nothing extraordinary about that." "Perhaps not," Morrison replied, "but the response to your help has been quite extraordinary indeed." He gestured toward the hills where Apache warriors still maintained their silent vigil. "When was the last time you saw 300 Apache warriors gather peacefully within sight of a Texas settlement?" Sheriff Crawford, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the officials arrived, finally spoke up. "Colonel, we need to understand what this means for our community. Are we looking at some kind of formal treaty arrangement here?" Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "That depends entirely on what Chief Running Wolf and Mr. Mitchell have in mind." Running Wolf stepped forward, his bearing taking on the ceremonial dignity of a man about to make a formal pronouncement. "Colonel Morrison, for too long our peoples have met only in conflict or in the shadow of conflict. Misunderstanding breeds fear and fear breeds violence. Today we have seen something different." The chief gestured toward Tom and Ayanna. A white farmer and an Apache mother found common ground in the simple recognition of shared humanity. "This gives us hope that a new path is possible." "What kind of path?" Morrison asked. "A path where Apache and white settlers can live as neighbors instead of enemies, where trade replaces raiding, where communication replaces suspicion, where disputes are settled with words instead of weapons." Morrison nodded slowly. "And Mr. Mitchell's role in this?" "Tom Mitchell has shown that he can be trusted by Apache people. His actions speak louder than any treaty document. We propose that he serve as an official intermediary, someone who can speak for both sides, who can help prevent misunderstandings before they become conflicts." Tom felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. This was far beyond anything he had imagined when he shared his bread with a hungry woman and her child. But as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, white and Apache alike, he began to understand the profound importance of this moment. "Colonel," Tom said quietly, "I'm not a politician or a diplomat. I'm just a farmer. But if both sides think I can help prevent bloodshed, I'm willing to try." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Mitchell, what you're proposing would be unprecedented in this territory. You would essentially become the first official liaison between the Apache Nation and the Texas territorial government. It's a position that would carry enormous responsibility and considerable personal risk." "What kind of risk?" "There are people on both sides who profit from conflict, who have no interest in peace. There are also people who would see any cooperation with Apache tribes as treason, just as there are Apache who would see cooperation with white settlers as betrayal." Ayanna, who had been listening intently while keeping Kachina entertained, spoke up. "Colonel Morrison, may I say something?" Morrison nodded, clearly curious about what the Apache woman would contribute to the discussion. "My people have a saying. The bridge that connects two cliffs must be strong enough to bear the weight of both sides. Tom Mitchell has already proven his strength by choosing compassion over fear. The question is not whether he is capable of this role, but whether your people and mine are wise enough to support him." Her words carried a challenge that wasn't lost on anyone present. Morrison glanced around at the assembled crowd, the nervous settlers from Cedar Falls, the federal officials, the Apache leaders, and the hundreds of warriors maintaining their respectful distance. "Chief Running Wolf," Morrison said finally, If we were to formalize such an arrangement, what assurances could you give that all Apache bands would recognize Mr. Mitchell's authority? I can speak for the Mescalero Confederation, Running Wolf replied. But you are right to ask about others. That is why I invited them to be here today. For the first time, Tom noticed that several of the Apache leaders in the official party bore the distinctive dress and markings of different bands. Running Wolf had clearly been thinking several steps ahead. One of these leaders, an elderly man with silver hair and a face like carved oak, stepped forward. I am Gray Eagle, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. We have heard the story of Tom Mitchell's kindness. My people also recognize his honor. Another leader, younger but carrying himself with unmistakable authority, joined them. I am Swift Arrow of the Lipan Apache. The winds have carried word of this farmer's generosity to our camps as well. We too would accept his voice in matters between our peoples. Tom felt his knees go slightly weak as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. These weren't just local tribal leaders. These represented major Apache confederations across the entire Southwest. The gathering wasn't just about one act of kindness. It had become a potential turning point in the history of the region. Colonel Morrison's expression had grown increasingly serious as each chief spoke. Gentlemen, he said, addressing the Apache leaders collectively, are you telling me that you're prepared to recognize Mr. Mitchell as an official representative in dealings with the territorial government? We are, Gray Eagle replied solemnly. But only if your government is prepared to recognize him with equal authority. The challenge was clear. The Apache leaders were offering unprecedented cooperation, but they wanted assurance that the white authorities would treat their chosen intermediary with genuine respect and power to negotiate. Morrison turned to Tom. Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you directly, are you prepared to accept this responsibility? It would mean giving up your life as a simple farmer. You'd be dealing with complex political situations, life and death decisions, conflicts that could affect thousands of people. Tom looked at Ayanna, who gave him an encouraging nod. He looked at little Kachina, now alert and healthy in his mother's arms. He thought of Sarah and what she would say about such an opportunity to build something better. Colonel, Tom said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, for 2 years I've been living like a ghost, just going through the motions of life. Yesterday, when I helped Ayanna and Kachina, I felt alive again for the first time since my wife died. If I can help prevent other families from being torn apart by conflict, if I can help build something better than what we've had, then yes, I'm prepared to try. The silence that followed was profound. Then gradually a sound began to build from the Apache warriors on the surrounding hills. Not a war cry, but something deeper and more ceremonial. It was the sound of acceptance, of approval, of hope for a future that none of them had dared imagine just days before. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his expression showing the struggle of a man grappling with rapid change. Colonel Morrison, what does this mean for Cedar Falls? For the other settlements in the region? It means, Morrison replied, that you'll have a neighbor who can help solve problems before they become crises. It means that instead of living in fear of Apache raids, you might find yourselves trading with Apache merchants. It means that your children might grow up in a world where cooperation is normal instead of exceptional. Henderson, the banker, still looked skeptical. And what guarantees do we have that this arrangement will be honored by all parties? Running Wolf answered before Morrison could speak. The same guarantee that Tom Mitchell had when he shared his bread with a hungry stranger. The belief that most people, given the chance, will choose honor over hatred. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tom's struggling farm, something unprecedented in the history of the American Southwest was taking shape. A poor farmer's simple act of kindness was becoming the foundation for a new way of life, a bridge between worlds that had been at war for generations. But even as the formal agreements were being discussed, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still to come. Building trust was one thing. Maintaining it in the face of inevitable challenges would be quite another. Still, as he watched Apache and white leaders working together to create something better, Tom Mitchell allowed himself to hope that Sarah's belief in the power of human kindness might change the world after all. 3 months later, Tom Mitchell stood on the porch of his farmhouse, now significantly expanded with the help of both Apache craftsmen and settlers from Cedar Falls. and marveled at how completely his world had changed. Where once there had been only struggling crops and lonely silence, there was now a bustling hub of activity that served as the unofficial capital of Apache settler cooperation in West Texas. The drought had finally broken 6 weeks earlier, and with it had come not just rain for his fields, but a prosperity he could never have imagined. The trading post that had been built adjacent to his farm was doing steady business, with Apache hunters bringing in buffalo hides, pottery, and beautifully crafted goods to trade for manufactured items, tools, and foodstuffs from the white settlements. But more importantly, it was working as a place where disputes could be settled peacefully. Just last week, Tom had mediated a disagreement between a rancher whose cattle had wandered onto traditional Apache hunting grounds and the band that had been tracking those same buffalo herds for weeks. What could have escalated into violence had instead been resolved with compensation, apologies, and an agreement about shared use of the territory. Ayanna emerged from the farmhouse carrying a steaming cup of coffee, her son Kachina playing at her feet with a wooden horse that one of the Apache craftsmen had carved for him. She had become Tom's unofficial assistant in his diplomatic work. Her ability to speak both languages fluently and her understanding of Apache customs proving invaluable in bridging cultural gaps. The delegation from Austin arrives this afternoon, she reminded him. Colonel Morrison says the territorial governor himself might be with them. Tom nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that came before important meetings. In the 3 months since his appointment as official liaison, he had hosted senators, Indian agents, military officers, and tribal leaders from across the Southwest. His little farm had become a destination for anyone interested in the Apache experiment, as the newspapers had dubbed it. "Are you ready for them?" Ayanna asked, settling into the rocking chair that had once been Sarah's favorite spot. "As ready as I'll ever be," Tom replied. "Though I still can't quite believe they're coming to ask a poor farmer for advice on Indian policy." "You're not a poor farmer anymore," Ayanna said with a smile. "You're a bridge builder." There's a difference, it was true. The success of the arrangement had brought Tom not just recognition, but also financial stability. The federal government paid him a salary for his liaison work. The trading post generated steady income, and his farm, now properly irrigated and benefiting from Apache agricultural knowledge, was producing better crops than he had ever imagined possible. But more than the money, Tom valued the sense of purpose that filled his days. Yesterday, he had helped negotiate a trade agreement that would bring Apache-made goods to markets as far away as New Orleans. Next week, he would travel with Running Wolf to meet with Comanche, leaders interested in establishing similar peaceful relationships with their white neighbors. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the main road. But these weren't the government officials they were expecting. This was a smaller group, moving fast and with obvious urgency. As the riders drew closer, Tom recognized one of them as Swift Arrow, the young Lipan Apache chief, who had been one of the first to endorse the liaison arrangement. The expression on Swift Arrow's face made Tom's stomach tighten with concern. "Tom Mitchell," Swift Arrow called as he reined in his horse at the edge of the yard. "We need to talk." "There's trouble coming." Ayanna stood quickly, instinctively moving to shield Kachina. "What kind of trouble?" "Mexican slavers," Swift Arrow replied grimly. "The same ones who attacked Ayanna's band. They've been raiding deeper into Texas, taking advantage of the peace between Apache and settlers. They think our cooperation has made us weak." Tom felt anger surge through him. The slave traders were a cancer on the borderlands, preying on anyone vulnerable enough to be captured and sold. That they would use the peace process as cover for their crimes was particularly galling. "How many?" Tom asked. "At least 50 men, well-armed and organized. They hit a mescalero camp 2 days ago, took women and children. Running Wolf is gathering warriors, but he wanted me to warn you first." "Warn me about what?" Swift Arrow's expression grew even more serious. "The slavers know about you, about what you represent. Word is they're planning to attack this place, to break the peace by making it look like Apache treachery. If they can kill you and make it appear that Apache did it, they believe the old conflicts will start again." Tom felt the blood drain from his face. Not because of the personal threat, but because of what such an attack would mean for everything they had built. 3 months of careful bridge building could be destroyed in a single night of violence and deception. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, maybe tomorrow. Their plan is to hit during the government visit. when there will be plenty of witnesses to spread the story of Apache betrayal. Ayanna touched Tom's arm. We could leave, she said quietly. Take Kachina and go north until this is resolved. Tom looked at her, then at his farm, then at the trading post where Apache and white customers were going about their daily business in peaceful cooperation. Everything he and Sarah had dreamed of building was here. Everything that represented hope for a better future was at stake. No, he said firmly. Running isn't the answer. If we let these men destroy what we've built, people will suffer for generations. Swift Arrow nodded approvingly. Running Wolf hoped you would say that. He has a plan, but it will require your help, and considerable courage from everyone involved. As the young chief outlined the strategy that the Apache leaders had developed, Tom realized that the peaceful farmer he had been was about to face the greatest test of his life. The bridge between two worlds that had been built on simple kindness was about to be tested by those who profited from hatred and fear. But looking at Ayanna's determined face, at little Kachina playing innocently in the yard, at the tangible proof of cooperation that surrounded them, Tom knew there was only one choice to make. The slavers wanted to destroy the peace. Instead, they were about to discover that some bridges, once built on a foundation of honor and mutual respect, were strong enough to withstand any storm.